right, good afternoon. Hope everyone enjoyed your lunch. We are going to, in the interest of staying on schedule, go ahead and get started, although I know there will be a lot more people joining as the gallery talks conclude and people find their way here. I'm Elliott Knight, Executive Director of the Alabama State Council on the Arts, and it's a pleasure of mine today to get to introduce our next two speakers for the afternoon. But first, I want to thank everybody who's helped put this program together, those of you who are attending, and everyone who is presenting. It's been really a lot of fun to think about this program and put it together over the last 18 months or so, so we're all very happy that we're here, and it's a great day to be inside a museum rather than out doing something outside. So our first lecturer of the afternoon will be Dr. Graham Boettcher from the Birmingham Museum of Art. Graham and I have both had the great fortune of finding ourselves in leadership positions in Alabama institutions that we inherited from directors, longtime directors who built a great foundation for us at those places, and it's been a great time over the last 7 years getting to know Graham, and look forward to hearing him speak about women artists of Alabama. But Graham's been in Alabama for, about 12 years now, 13 years now, and he is a Yale graduate and University of Washington, and so he will talk about some of our great women artists of Alabama. And after that, Chester Higgins, who many of you have met and heard about already some this morning. I was lucky to get to meet Chester a couple of years back. The council helped fund actually commissioned an exhibition of his with the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, where he came to Alabama and made portraits of people who were children foot soldiers back in Birmingham. And I got to meet him at a luncheon for the unveiling of that. And it was just such a great experience to get to watch families stand in front of the portraits he had made and then take new pictures with their families in front of those portraits. And in talking with him there, he expressed an interest in revisiting his early Alabama photographs before he had a 4-decade career at the New York Times. And so when we began putting this together and thinking about artists who could be a part of this program, he was very top of mind there and thinking about that. So I'm very looking forward to him sharing some of that, the work he did here early in his career and what he's done since. So I think that's enough. We have plenty of content to pack into these next two sessions. So without further ado, Graham Boettcher.
Thank you, Elliott, for that kind introduction. I want to echo the previous speaker's thanks to the organizers. Special thanks to my longtime friend, Alice Novak. Always a pleasure to come to Montgomery to speak. And I would like to thank the funders of this gathering. I think most of you know that our state motto, and I won't attempt the Latin, is "We dare defend our rights." I would maybe amend that to say we dare defend our rights to have a 3-year-long bicentennial celebration. Only Alabama would be so audacious as to do so. But you know what? It's a wonderful thing. Because over the course of the last 3 years, so much attention has been brought to our native arts from so many corners of the state, and it really brought us all together working toward a common goal. I don't think that this much concentrated attention from so many individuals and institutions has occurred since the landmark Made in Alabama catalog, and that's been, oh gosh, more than 20 years ago. So a wonderful thing. I love our audacity. I would just, a point of personal note, I am not a native Alabamian. I grew up hearing stories of Alabama. My grandmother and great-grandmother lived in Birmingham for 1 year, 1932. My grandmother attended the Powell School, which still stands, though it was gutted by a fire several years back. I am from another Beham, though. I'm from Bellingham, Washington. Our motto is the city of subdued excitement. So maybe you can see why I traded the city of subdued excitement for the Magic City. Far more exciting. Before I get into today's talk, though, I also want to acknowledge the work of the scholars who've been working on the art of Alabama for a very, very long time. I look out at this audience and I see so many of you here. I see individuals, collectors, colleagues from other institutions who've made these past 13 years a magnificent experience. And in particular, I want to give thanks to the kind of some of the founding scholars of this field: Paul Richardson, Margaret Lynn Osfeld, Bill Island, Vicki Lee Ingham, Stephen Goldfarb, and Lynn Barstis Williams Katz, among many, many others. Thank you for your important work throughout your careers, bringing the art of Alabama to the fore. Now, it's as if Bill Island teed this up all too perfectly when he quoted Lamar Dodd last night, speaking about in the South, women paint china and the men paint houses. Because what is my first image? None other than a china painting studio in Birmingham, Alabama, shared by the artists Carrie Hill and Mrs. John B. Ralston. I have tried in vain to discover her actual first name. She is always known as Mrs. J.B. Ralston, and her husband was a prominent judge in Birmingham at the time. This was not an uncommon scene in Birmingham in the early 20th century. Birmingham finally had proper art classes that it could offer to those who were interested, and these art classes, which function not only as didactic events for the teaching of art, but also as social events, were often covered in the pages of the social column in the Birmingham News. And I'll just read you one account from 1903. The receptions and exhibits among the studios yesterday afternoon marked the initial event in the social life of the city this season. They were the first gathering among congenial friends since the events of early last spring, and proved to be the source of genuine enjoyment. The studios were at their prettiest. Each artist was a genial and attractive hostess, and passing pleasantries, admiring criticisms, and bursts of admiration and genial spirits were the order of the afternoon. This also maybe connects with Dr. Island's talk last night when he reminded us of some of the gender roles to which women were expected to conform, not just in antebellum Alabama, but in postbellum/Reconstruction Alabama. Women and women artists were expected to behave a certain way. And one of the things that one finds most frequently when researching the important women artists of this period is that their physical appearance is described as often as the aesthetic appearance of their works. I'm glad that we have moved beyond that. I can only imagine if museum directors and curators such as myself suffered the same scrutiny. That said, as another additional point of departure, I want to point out that the talk that I'll give in the next now 40 minutes or so consists of select examples. In many cases, the examples I've chosen are low-hanging fruit for me. They are artists for whom I had the pleasure of working on their legacy as part of our collection at the Birmingham Museum of Art. But this does not tell the full story of women artists in the late 19th and early 20th century in Alabama. The one thing you will notice that even though the club has gone co-ed, it's no longer exclusively a boys' club as it was in the fine arts in the antebellum period. It now includes women painters and sculptors. The cast of characters is exclusively white. Additional work needs to be done. I think it's worth saying that African Americans were systematically disenfranchised through structural racism in this state, which kept them impoverished and kept them from the opportunities that their white counterparts enjoyed. All of the women that I'm discussing today, despite their families experiencing some financial setbacks as a result of the Civil War and later the Great Depression, came from a great deal of privilege, relatively speaking. It is still expensive to send your child to New York City or Paris to study art, and it was expensive back then, and these women were able to afford that. So I wanted to point that out. There is a lot of work left to be done to broaden the narrative and make it ever more accurate. So, starting roughly chronologically with these select examples, I'd like to begin with Maria Howard Whedon, who simply went by the name Howard. I think there has been speculation that this was in order not to be scrutinized as a woman when submitting her work to publishers, that people would assume that she was a man with the name Howard. I'm not sure how founded that was. There's a wonderful house museum in Huntsville of her work. She was born in Huntsville to a relatively prosperous family. Her father, William Whedon, was a physician. Sadly, he passed away before she was even born, leaving her mother to raise her and her 5 siblings by themselves. Their home in Huntsville, a lovely cottage, was occupied by the Union Army during the war, and the family went to live in the slave quarters behind the main house. They eventually left for Tuskegee, where she attended the Tuskegee Female College, which later became Huntington College, and she studied there with William Fry, about whom we've heard quite a bit. So she had great training. She returned to Huntsville and discovered not only after the war that the house was in shambles, but that her family's assets had been greatly depleted. And she set about trying to help her family improve their lot. She initially painted small gifts, things like postcards, place cards, just small little token paintings that she could sell relatively easily. And these helped bring her some stability to her family situation. She had the opportunity in 1893, like many Americans, to attend the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. And there, as her biography tells, she was incensed by the caricatured depictions of African Americans that she saw on view in the fine arts displays. She felt that she could do better. She was surrounded by African Americans in Huntsville, and she went back to Huntsville determined to create realistic likenesses of people that she knew in her daily life, and also individuals who are well known throughout Huntsville. These are a couple examples of her work that received wide praise for their accuracy and almost photographic likeness. By all accounts, she preferred not to work from photographs despite their photorealism, but liked to work directly from life with the sitter. She would often engage the sitters in long conversations, hearing stories, and many of these stories she ultimately collected and published in a series of books of African American folk stories from the period. She also wrote under a pseudonym. Her pseudonym, and I think this is a little ironic, she maybe was keenly aware of her own whiteness and the fact that she appropriated black stories for many of her published volumes. Her pseudonym was Flake White, as in snowflake. She also had the opportunity to to exhibit her work broadly in Paris and in Berlin in 1895, and sadly she died of tuberculosis at the age of 59. And again, I'll reference Bill Island when he remarked that one asks here not where are you from, but where do your people bury? In all but one case in my entire talk, even when artists went away for their training or lived abroad, they always came home to Alabama to be interred. And she is buried in Maple Hill Cemetery in Huntsville. And I'm showing you, up until now, we don't have a work by Howard Whedon in Birmingham's collection, though I'm grateful to Patrick Cather, who, thanks to him, that's about to change. This is a promise gift, and I think some of you know Patrick's name. He has been among the foremost collectors of Alabama art in this state for decades, and much of that collection has come to the Birmingham Museum of Art, and much of his archival materials have gone to the University of Alabama at Birmingham. Let's see here. There we go. Clara Weaver Parrish. Now, the Weavers are maybe the closest thing this state has ever had to artistic dynasty along the lines of well, no one really rivals the Peels, but maybe along the lines of the Wyeths. The Weavers of Selma were a highly artistic family with multiple generations of artists. The chief among those artists was Clara Weaver Parrish, and she was born to children of two prominent families outside of Selma on the family plantation. Her father was a weaver, of course, and her mother was a minter. And her parents encouraged her talents from a very early age. They sent her to New York City to study with William Merritt Chase and Henry Siddons Mowbray, Julian Alden Weir, some of the leading artists of the day. She did return to Selma, and that's where she met and fell in love with William Peck Parish of Greensboro, and they wed in 1882 and then relocated to New York City in 1890, where he set about becoming a moderately successful stockbroker, and she pursued her artistic passion with abandon. She exhibited widely throughout the city, quickly gaining the attention of her peers in artistic circles to the extent that she herself was included in the artists exhibiting at the World's Columbian Exposition. She was incredibly adept in multiple media. I'm showing you here an example of one of her etchings. There are several on view here at the museum right now. Etchings were a great way for an artist to make a living. They were pot boilers because you could work on one painting for a month and then at the end of the month have one thing to sell. But if you made an etching, you could maybe get 15, maximum 20 impressions, depending on how deeply the plate was carved. And you would have multiple things to sell, albeit maybe not for the same price as a painting, but they kept food boiling in the pot on the stove. She was gifted in multiple media. Watercolor is one of the things she was best known for. She was also known for her work in pastel. I'm grateful to the person who attended my talk who pointed out that the work on view that is partially watercolor is maybe even more so pastel. Here's an example of what I regard as her most important pastel, which is in our collection, purchased from a descendant of Clara Weaver Parrish's husband, and this is the very work entitled Night, which she exhibited at the 1900 Paris Universal Exposition. It still even retains a fragment of its exhibition label on the back. And I think you could see that there's a clear indebtedness to Whistler's arrangement in gray and black #1, better known as Whistler's Mother. Parish had two daughters, both of whom died in infancy. Sadly, she lost also her husband at a young age. When she was just 40, her husband died at the age of 41. By all accounts, and I've heard this from a member of the family who passed away a couple of years ago, but with whom I was close, she felt terribly lonely, and she even reached out to her sister and asked if she could have one of her sister's children to raise as her own. Her sister said no, but very, very kindly let one of her daughters visit Clara Weaver Parrish in New York often and travel with her to Paris. And this is that favorite niece, Rose Norman Tarver, and we're fortunate to have this work in the collection donated by Rosalind Lipscomb for us, who was the granddaughter of the sitter, a descendant. I think many of you know that Clara Weaver Parrish went on to become a designer of ecclesiastical windows for Tiffany Studios in New York City. She began her work with Tiffany in 1895, and I think that it's typically Tiffany did not like to employ married women, and Clara was of great enough stature that I think he made it an exception. And she was responsible for windows in St. Michael's Church in New York, at the Church of the Holy Cross in Uniontown, which is a Clara Weaver Parrish design, but not a Tiffany window, made by a different maker. The Christ Episcopal Church in Tuscaloosa, First Baptist of Selma, and here St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Selma. And this is the very window that she designed in memory of her husband, William. That was their family church. We are fortunate in Birmingham's collection to have one of the preliminary studies in watercolor for that very window, which we purchased from a descendant of the family. Now, I'll turn next to Sister Rose Pettis Weaver. Not many people know about Rose's work because much of Rose's work has stayed within the extended Weaver family, but it was quite spectacular. She was a master wood carver, and she created dowry chests and fireplace bellows, and this, which is one of, I think, 4 or 5 panels for the family staircase in their home in Selma, which we have in our collection in Birmingham. It's really remarkable work, and directly carved. She didn't just design it and ask someone else to carve it, she carved it with her own hands. This is where I get a little bit out of chronological order. Any discussion of the Weaver family, I would be remiss not to mention their niece, Rose and Clara's niece, Anne von Weaver Norton, who was the daughter of their brother William. She went on to become a very notable sculptor after an initial start as a children's book illustrator. According to family stories, she only became a children's book illustrator to raise enough money so that she could go to art school in the Northeast. She initially attended Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts. She studied at the National Academy of Design and the Cooper Union Art School and the Art Students League. So she had some of the best training that money could afford, and she became studio assistant to none other than Alexander Archipenko, one of the leading modern sculptors of the period, and she met with wonderful success. She received 2 Carnegie Fellowships and exhibited her work at the Museum of Modern Art and the Whitney. And this particular work, which entered the Birmingham Museum of Art's collection 4 years ago, was exhibited at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, and of all places ended up at a small auction house in Paris, where it was discovered by a picker who happened to be from West Palm Beach, Florida, and recognized it as Anne Weaver Norton's work. Anne Weaver Norton's work does eventually take a turn to Florida. She got a job in 1942 to teach sculpture at the Norton Gallery and School of Art, founded by Ralph Norton, the former chair of Acme Steel, and Mr. Norton eventually became her husband, which was a wonderful thing for Anne von Weaver Norton, because she'd been living hand to mouth mostly, commission to commission, and this meant she would never have to worry again. She became a millionaire with that marriage and did not have to worry about the cost of her supplies. And we'll see in a moment how that changed. I do want to point out the indebtedness of Norton's early work to African sculpture. Like many modernists, she was deeply interested in African art, and you can see the clear connection with the so-called coffee bean eyes of this Nkisi figure. Well, once the means were there, she began working on a monumental scale, and her largest works can be seen at the Ann Norton Sculpture Garden in West Palm Beach. It's a wonderful place, and she began to create these larger-than-life works, some of them figural, like this, Seven Beings of 1965, others abstract, such as Gateway to Knowledge, which was completed 2 years after her death. It's been suggested recently by the author Caroline Seebohm, who wrote a wonderful biography of Anne Weaver Norton entitled Monumental Dreams, that perhaps works like these were experienced by some of the edifices evident in the surroundings of her childhood home, namely the ruins of the Crocheron home in Cahaba, which is a mere 13 miles from where Anne was raised. I'll leave that to you to decide whether that's not the case, but I find it a very interesting theory. I don't want to leave Mobile out of the mix. It is too easy for me to focus on Birmingham and towns closer to Birmingham. I think undoubtedly the most successful female artist to come out of Mobile during this period was Louise Lyonshustis. She was born to a prominent family. Her father was a physician and surgeon. Her mother, Rachel, was from a prominent Jewish family in Columbia, South Carolina, which was known, she was known for her intellect and also, as I mentioned, also described for her beauty. This was the case, like mother, like daughter. An account published in the 1891 issue of the Illustrated American spoke of Louise Lyonshustis, describing her thusly, quote, "This extremely pretty girl is one of an unusually large number of handsome and clever women credited to Mobile. The talent and physical attractions of many belles and artists who have made the Alabama city famous are recognized through the length and breadth of the land, giving the town a happy reputation that the subject of this sketch has done much to support," end quote. Indeed, she was an extremely skilled portraitist. I think you'll agree from the examples here. She studied with some of the best artists of the day. She studied with Thomas Eakins in Philadelphia and William Merritt Chase in New York, and she exhibited her work around the country. Interestingly, it was also noted in Who's Who Among Women in America, the 1914 edition. They described her career and the cities in which she exhibited, and then the final sentence of her biography is, "Favors women's suffrage." So we know what side of the debate she came down on. And that's true of many of the artists in this talk. They were known not only for their artistic work, but for their social and political convictions, suffrage being at the top of the list. The work that brought her the most fame, though, was this work on the left, The Sea Captain's Children. This is a print of it. It won first prize, $2,500 in the 1925 Brown and Bigelow National Art Competition. I think some of you may recognize Brown and Bigelow as a leading producer of calendars that were always illustrated with artists' work, based in St. Paul, Minnesota. And so this image was reproduced not hundreds, but thousands of times and sent out around the country, appended to calendars and other promotional materials. And there's an example for Westfield Farmers Produce from Westfield, Wisconsin on the right. It gives you an idea. If you go on eBay and type in Louise Lyonshustis, you will find 2 or 3 examples of this for sale at any given time. All right, well, back to Montgomery. Anne Wilson Goldthwaite. I find Anne Goldthwaite to be one of the most fascinating artists that Alabama ever produced. And the portrait of Anne Goldthwaite by Clara Weaver Parrish that's on view right now at this museum, if you have not yet seen it, you are missing the opportunity to see one of the greatest portraits by an Alabamian of an Alabamian. So please don't miss it. She came from a prominent family, born in Montgomery, but spent her early childhood in Dallas until she was orphaned at the age of 15. She was shipped back to Montgomery to be raised by aunts and uncles, and according to family legend, her fiancé was killed in a duel, and her uncle sent her to New York City to study art in order to lift her spirits. Don't know if that's true or not, but it makes a great story. Suffice it to say, she never had a second fiancé. She remained unmarried for the rest of her life. I can't speak to whether or not she had additional relations, but one of the things that is clear, many of the artists in this talk remained unmarried because I think as Bill alluded to last night, the expectations of women in this state, particularly married women, were such that one had limited opportunities to pursue much of a career outside of the home. And so marriage and child rearing would have effectively, at that time in history, ended an artistic career. She studied at the National Academy of Design, but then almost immediately left for Paris. She too was engaged in making beautiful etchings, which provided her immediate means of support. While she was in Paris, she started to run with a very interesting crowd. She got to know Gertrude Stein, and I'll say more about that in just a moment. But she hung out with the Bohemian expat set. Maybe it's not surprising then that when she returned to the United States, she became the only Alabama artist, male or female, to exhibit in the landmark 1913 Armory Show. And this is one of the two works she exhibited in that landmark, groundbreaking exhibition, which introduced abstract painting to the United States in full force, particularly Cubism and Marcel Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase. At the Armory Show, she became close friends with Catherine Dreier, one of the leading proponents of modernism, who went on to assemble the Société Anonyme collection, which is now at Yale, with Man Ray. But that being the case, it's interesting. Here she participates in the most important exhibition of the 20th century, arguably. She is friends with some of the leading avant-garde artists and promoters, such as Catherine Dreier. But in 1928, the Montgomery Advertiser ran a sketch of Anne Goldthwaite, which told us a little bit about, and I'll return to that in a second, what Anne Goldthwaite thought of abstraction. Quote, "Being no extremist, she believes that we are not abstract. We have fingers, toes, hands. They must be in the picture, like that. She cannot believe that Brancusi, whose bird in flight metal sculpture, so-called, was so abstract that customs officials debated as to whether it was art or hardware. She can't believe it's one for the ages. In other words, her mules will still be mules to that person that looks at them 200 years hence, always providing there are still mules," end quote. So even though she ran with a fairly abstract crowd, let's say, in more ways than one, she was a realist through and through, although she did engage in painterly abstraction. This was one of her great successes, purchased by none other than Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney for the fledgling Whitney Museum in 1931, a beautiful portrait of a woman named Rebecca. And then I said I would return to Gertrude Stein, and you're kind of saying, well, what does this have to do with Gertrude Stein? She used to return, Anne Goldthwaite would return to Alabama every summer during the hottest months, and in 1929, that summer, she, instead of making paintings, decided to make a series of small clay sculpture, which she initially made for fun, but they were immediately sold, one of which was even purchased by the Metropolitan Museum of Art. This one is in our collection in Birmingham, and there's one here in Montgomery's collection, and I can't help but think that she had Gertrude Stein in mind. When she first met Gertrude Stein in 1906, Goldthwaite said that she looked something like an immense dark brown egg. That is Gertrude Stein posing for her now very famous portrait sculpture with the artist Joe Davidson. See a similarity? Goldthwaite would have absolutely known this work. I haven't found the smoking gun, but the circumstantial evidence is too good to ignore that maybe when she sculpted this unknown woman in Montgomery, that she had a little hint of Gertrude Stein lingering in mind. I also just want to end this part on Anne Goldthwaite by mentioning this column. Life begins at 40, and she said, Anne Goldthwaite, its president, the president of the New York Women Painters, says, few fine painters do their best work before they are 40. I think that for all of those of us over 40, I think that's really exciting news. I also want to quote a 1934 radio interview with Anne Goldthwaite, which speaks to her aspirations for women artists. Quote, the best praise that women artists have been able to command until now is to have said that she paints like a man, but that women have a valid place as women artists is both obvious and logical. We want to speak to an audience that asks simply, is it good, not was it done by a woman, end quote. This brings us back up to Birmingham to Carrie Hill. And Carrie Hill's career started with a train wreck. It wasn't a train wreck, but it started with a train wreck. She grew up was born in Vance, Alabama, and a train bound from Chicago to New Orleans for Mardi Gras wrecked just outside of Vance. All of the children, of course, train wreck would have been the biggest news that had happened in a decade in Vance, Alabama. They went out to see what was going on, and Carrie Hill spotted an artist passing away at the time, who'd been a passenger on the train, sitting beneath a tree, making a painting of the local red schoolhouse. And she was so entranced by this that she went home, she took her father's clothes brush, tore out some bristles, found a stick, a little bit of silk thread, made her own brush, stole all the ink out of her father's desk. She got black, green, and red ink, crushed up some pokeberries for another pigment, and then took the bluing from her mother's laundry and started painting. And that is how her painting career began. And she told that story many, many times over, and I think it changed slightly every version. But she was a great storyteller. In 1891, at the age of 16, she moved to Birmingham. She took lessons with local artists such as Caroline Lovell and William D. Parish, who had moved to Birmingham to found the Birmingham Art School. She began teaching art in her own right, and she taught with Mrs. Ralston, and yes, they did teach China painting. It paid the bills and was very popular. There was a national vogue for China painting at that time. Let's see here. There we go. There's an example of her China painting. Beautiful, beautiful work, but I think she had aspirations not just to stop with China painting, which was very much thought of as ladies' work at that time. She aspired to be an easel painter, and that's exactly what she went on to do. She got herself as much schooling as she possibly could. She studied on Martha's Vineyard with Arthur Friedlander. She took summer trips to Europe 3 times with George Elmer Brown, one of the leading painters of the day. This is one example of the type of work that she was doing, resulting from her various trips. She was also, and here's a portrait of her in later life from 1923, she was also in love with the art of Alabama, or with the native Alabama landscapes. And she often remarked that everything she needed was surrounding her. And so she focused as much attention on local scenery, such as the old mill at Mountain Brook, or pine trees of Alabama, one of her perennial favorite subjects. And she once said, quote, the subject matter the subject matters little. It is what the artist puts into it that counts. So the field to me is limitless. There are possibilities everywhere, and everything appeals to me that is beautiful and artistic, end quote. And I think as Kate alluded this morning, she also turned her eye once or twice to industrial scenery, though the strong preference was for the natural beauty of Alabama, not the industrial sublime. And she was one of the few Alabama artists fortunate enough to get a mural commission, not one but two, during the Great Depression. And one of those, the one she painted in Jasper, is no longer extant, but the storybook mural that she did at the East Lake Branch Library in Birmingham, based on Mother Goose, is still around. And you can see that she's actually drawing heavily. If you look at the Queen of Hearts with the tarts, and you can see behind him the King of Hearts, she's quoting heavily the figures from Blanche Fisher Wright's iconic Real Mother Goose. How many of you had that book growing up? Yeah, I had it. It was one of my favorites. I still have my copy of it. And you can see right there the Queen of Hearts and the King of the King from Sing a Song of Sixpence are directly from these illustrations. Moving on to Hannah Elliott, and am running out of time, but I will do my best to make it all the way to Zelda Fitzgerald. Hannah Elliott was probably the greatest eccentric that Birmingham ever had among its artistic community. She perennially wore a black hat, dress, and neck ribbon. They were her uniform from the 1930s on. She was rarely without a cigarette. This is by her student and friend Arthur Stewart, another Birmingham artist. And the closed shutters in the back aren't accidental. Arthur Stewart remarked that Hannah Elliott's home, she always kept the shutters closed so people wouldn't see the inch of dust on every surface. She had far better things to do than keep house. She was one of the great artists of Birmingham. This is how Stewart saw her. This is how the Mobile artist Genevieve Sutherland depicted Miss Hannah Elliott around 1942. Again, very much in the uniform. One of her friends remarked, Hannah dressed exactly as she pleases. If capes are completely out of vogue and Hannah has a cape she likes, she wears it, yet with all her delightful individualism. In quiet, unobtrusive little courtesies, Hannah Elliott is as much as any woman I know, the Old South with all of its quaint charm, end quote. What Hannah was known for were her magnificent miniatures, which were commissioned by the leading citizens of Birmingham and other cities around the state, and she had commissions from far and wide, from the Midwest and the Northeast. Her work received national attention not only during her lifetime, and I'm showing you a few examples, but in the massive 3-volume tome by Bill Gertz, Art Across America. He writes, in Birmingham, Alabama's major postbellum industrial city, cultural development was initially slow. Probably the city's finest and most innovative painter at the turn of the century was Hannah Elliott, Alabama's most significant miniaturist. And the thing that makes her miniatures, I think, different from the rest, she was very annoyed by miniatures that tried to create miniatures that looked like photographs. She thought this was utterly wrong, and that any miniature, worth its materials should look like an oil painting. You should see the handling of the brush, and it should have a jewel-like quality. And I think you'll agree these examples, particularly the portrait of another artist, Rosalie Pettis Price on the right, have that quality. I will move quickly, I think I've got 3 minutes left, to Lucille Douglass. Lucille Douglass, she started in Birmingham much like her contemporaries Carrie Hill and Hannah Elliott. She was a leading figure in the Birmingham art scene. She was an organizer of the Birmingham Art Club, and she had the benefit of a strong foundation in figure painting, which she was able to gain in her studies in New York City at the Art Students League. It's significant that women were now allowed to draw not just the female figure, but the male figure as well. And we have 132 of her student works in our collection in Birmingham. You've already seen this in Kate's presentation, her wonderful poster for the Birmingham Art Club. Her real contribution, though, is being one of the leading chroniclers of China and Southeast Asia. She initially went to Asia as part of a Methodist mission. She started a department for slide painting, hand-painted slides, lantern slides, for Methodist missionaries to use in her work. She stayed in China for 4 years and then traveled to Southeast Asia, experiencing Angkor Wat in Cambodia, which became the basis for the rest of her life's work. She produced a series of really spectacular and detailed etchings of Angkor Wat, which were acquired by none other than the Metropolitan Museum of Art. In terms of the sheer number of words in national publications devoted to any single Alabama artist during this period, I might actually argue that Lucille Douglass was the single most famous Alabama artist in the United States at this point. It's a hunch. I haven't counted every single word, but it's pretty spectacular. So with that, I did not make it to Zelda Fitzgerald. If you came to hear me talk about Zelda, I'm sorry, we're out of time. What's that? I'll show you one Zelda slide. We'll show the best, we'll show if we can get to it. There we go. Let's stop on that. This is a work by Zelda Fitzgerald that recently entered Birmingham's collection, particularly significant because it belonged to her daughter, Scotty, and it's the house where Scotty was raised. Because of F. Scott Fitzgerald's alcoholism and Zelda's mental illness, Scotty was left most of the time to be raised by F. Scott's literary agent and his wife, the Obers, Harold and Ann Ober. So this beautiful watercolor of the Ober house in Scarsdale had particularly significant meaning for their daughter, and we're fortunate now to have it in Birmingham's collection. So sorry to leave you short on some of those artists, but please feel free to find me in our next break, and I'm happy to talk to you about Geneva Mercer or Zelda Fitzgerald or anyone else you want to know more about. Thank you.